shadows of the Great War. Every great fire begins with a spark, but rarely is that spark what it seems. To understand the outbreak of the Second World War, one must not start with tanks crossing borders, nor with fiery speeches in front of hypnotized crowds. One must go even further back. Return to the silence that remained after the previous carnage. To that Europe of 1919, trying to smile among ruins, with open wounds in its body and soul. The echo of the First World War did not extinguish on the battlefields. It dragged on like an invisible smoke for 2 decades, permeating the hearts, governments, and even the dreams of an entire generation. That was the true seed of the disaster. A seed that did not grow with time, but with disillusionment. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in the opulent French palace that gave it its name, was not a peace agreement. It was a sentence disguised as protocol. Germany, humiliated and stripped, was forced to accept absolute guilt for the conflict, and with it came impossible reparations, loss of territories, the dissolution of its army, and institutionalized shame in every clause. What the signatories celebrated as justice was experienced by the Germans as a betrayal. A wound that did not heal but festered for years, feeding the collective resentment of a country that felt betrayed by the victors and abandoned by its own leaders. In Berlin, the victory banners that once promised glory fell apart under the rain. In Munich, soldiers returning from the front were greeted not with parades, but with silence. In rural areas, children were born with the names of fallen brothers, and in cafes, the most common conversation was how someone could have survived so much horror only to return to a country in ruins. The economy, collapsed by the war and imposed reparations, entered a downward spiral. Inflation became monstrous, to the point that a loaf of bread could cost as much as a bicycle on Monday, and twice as much on Tuesday. Banknotes were printed with more zeros than logic, and the most common images were citizens burning paper money to keep warm in winter. It was cheaper than coal. But beyond hunger and poverty, what deteriorated was trust. The Weimar Republic, born as an attempt at modern democracy, was seen as a weak regime, imposed by foreign forces and sustained by gray politicians who talked a lot but solved little. The countryside looked at the city with suspicion. Conservatives hated communists, and in the middle of this polarization, a gap began to open that dangerously resembled an abyss. Nobody trusted anyone, and in this breeding ground, the most radical voices began to grow louder. Not only Germany bled inside. Italy, which had won on paper, also felt betrayed by the treaties. Its territorial reward was less than promised, and the country dragged a similar exhaustion to the rest of Europe. In the streets of Rome and Milan, war veterans grouped together, frustrated, seeking meaning for their sacrifices. It was there that a journalist named Benito Mussolini knew better than anyone how to read that collective anxiety. With a black shirt and clenched fist, he transformed frustration into a movement. Fascism, that ideology based on force, order, and national identity, found fertile ground among those who no longer believed in debate or democracy. France, for its part, won the war but lost faith in its security. Aware that a new German offensive was only a matter of time, it built the Maginot Line, a series of concrete and steel fortifications along its eastern border. It was a modern wall, designed to resist yesterday's enemy, but incapable of anticipating tomorrow's. The United Kingdom, more geographically isolated, tried to regain calm through a policy of international balance. Its population, exhausted after 4 years of war and unwilling to repeat the disaster, favored moderate governments that, unknowingly, would gradually cede more and more ground to extremists in the name of stability. Meanwhile, in the East, Tsarist Russia had disappeared after a fierce revolution. Communism had taken power with blood, and under the leadership of Lenin, and later Stalin, the Soviet Union transformed into an ideological machine. Purges, forced collectivization, internal exile, and a system that controlled everything from newspapers to thoughts. but also accelerated industrialization, omnipresent propaganda, and a firm intention to influence the rest of Europe. Fear of communism became an obsession in the West, a fear that would soon be used as an excuse to tolerate and even promote its enemies. The 1920s were, in many ways, a kind of illusory breath. Cities began to rebuild, cafes filled with poetry, jazz, and silent cinema. But it was fragile happiness, superficial, sustained by unstable economies and promises of modernity that did not reach everyone. On Wall Street, numbers seemed to dance to the rhythm of progress until they suddenly collapsed in 1929. The crash of the American stock market spread like a seismic wave throughout the world. Factories closed, banks went bankrupt, massive unemployment. Democracies wobbled, and the need for a savior became almost desperate. It was in the middle of that despair that Adolf Hitler appeared. He was not a lightning bolt in a clear sky, but a direct consequence of everything before. A war veteran, without charisma in his early years, but with an impressive ability to absorb the surrounding hatred and turn it into discourse. His book, Mein Kampf, written in prison after a failed coup attempt, was more than a manifesto. It was a warning that very few took seriously. The promise to restore German greatness, to erase the humiliation of Versailles, and to point out culprits, communists, Jews, liberals, was gaining followers in every corner of the country. In villages where churches closed for lack of parishioners, in factories where the noise of machines had stopped, in homes where children slept hungry, Hitler was not a monster who arrived suddenly. He was a response, a mistaken response, but understandable within the context of that despair that had been fermenting for 20 years. Thus, we arrive at the threshold. Europe was divided not only by borders but by scars. On the surface, the war had ended long ago. But beneath pacifist speeches and diplomatic receptions, there beat a deep resentment, a contained rage waiting for its moment. The shadows of the Great War never dissipated. They only learned to dress in civilian clothes. And when the time came, it took a spark, yes. But it was not that spark that lit the fire. The fire was ready long before anyone dared to name it. The rise of the men of iron. In the years following the Great War, the streets of Europe changed color. The stone blackened by gunpowder was covered with propaganda posters, and the cobblestones that once rumbled under the march of columns of soldiers now vibrated with the shouts of hypnotized crowds. The squares filled again, but this time not with mourning demonstrations, but with an exaltation that bordered on collective fever. These were not spontaneous celebrations. They were choreographed rituals. Europe was transforming, and it did so to the rhythm of firm speeches, unquestionable promises, and parades with outstretched arms. New figures were being forged, or perhaps not so new. Men hardened by the failure of others and fed by an absolute ideal. Men who spoke with the certainty of those who never doubt. Men of iron. In Italy, the transition was swift, almost lightning fast. The figure of Benito Mussolini emerged like a shadow growing with every step. From a provocative journalist to prime minister, his path was paved by the discontent of a country that felt it had won a war, but lost the peace. That young man from the Socialist Party, who had defended class struggle, transformed into the leader of Italian fascism with surprising speed. In 1922, the March on Rome sealed his rise. There was no need to fire a single bullet. Power changed hands under the applause of those who saw in him an authoritarian hope against democratic chaos. In a short time, the parliament was turned into mere scenery. The press was tamed, and the opposition silenced. Mussolini was not yet a dictator in the purest form, but he had achieved something equally dangerous. He had convinced millions of people that they needed him. The essence of the fascism he promoted was emotional before ideological. It was about restoring a national identity that had been trampled, about exalting an ancient greatness, about turning history into a mirror that reflected only what was convenient. The Roman Empire, the glory of the Caesars, the power of a unified Italy, all were brought to the present with a mixture of nostalgia and promise. The uniforms, the salutes, the chants were not accessories. They were symbols designed to provoke something visceral in the population. And they worked. Because when a hungry nation finds someone who yells at it with conviction, it tends to listen before thinking. In Germany, conditions were different, but the result was even more radical. After the economic collapse of 1929, misery settled as a permanent guest. Entire families lived on watery soup. Unemployed workers wandered aimlessly, and the lines in front of soup kitchens merged with the queues for bread. In that context, the Weimar parliamentary system, unable to generate clear answers, began to crumble. Traditional parties collapsed at the polls, while the extremes, both left and right, gathered millions of votes. It was then that a marginal party, with a long name and a disturbing symbol, began to rise without pause. The National Socialist German Workers' Party had been born years before, but it was in the 1930s when it found its moment, and with it, its definitive voice: Adolf Hitler. That Austro-Hungarian corporal who had served in the First World War with more pride than military talent had something lacking in the political discourse of his time: intensity. His oratory was not elegant nor polished, but it struck like a hammer. It was theatrical, yes, but also loaded with an internal logic that, although based on falsehoods, had a dangerous coherence. He identified clear enemies, offered radical solutions, and spoke of destiny. For many Germans, it was a relief to hear someone who doubted nothing. When Hitler was appointed chancellor in January of 1933, many believed he would be a decorative figure, that conservative sectors would manipulate him, that the system would tame him. But they made the mistake of thinking they were facing just another politician. Within months, the Reichstag fire gave him the perfect pretext to suspend freedoms, outlaw parties, and arrest opponents. The Enabling Act, passed that same year, granted him almost absolute powers. Germany ceased to be a republic with fragile democracy to become a regime where a single voice dictated the course of all. The Gestapo, the SS, control of education, racial exaltation, all were organized with a speed that remains chilling today. But Hitler did not project himself as a dictator. He presented himself as a messiah, someone who did not seek personal power, but national redemption. His narrative was built with grand words and ancient symbols. The swastika, taken from millenary traditions, became the emblem of the new order. The imperial eagle returned. Marches with torches and drums filled the nights, and children were instructed from infancy to worship the Führer. It was not only political control, it was total cultural transformation. Meanwhile, in Spain, another process began to take shape. The monarchy had fallen. The republic was born with moderate hopes but also with sharp internal divisions. The polarization between left and right was fierce, and the accumulated hatreds exploded in 1936 with a military uprising that led to a civil war. Amid the chaos, a Galician general with a dry character and hard gaze consolidated his power among the nationalists. Francisco Franco, unlike Hitler or Mussolini, was neither a charismatic speaker nor a passionate ideologue. He was a cold, efficient strategist who advanced without haste but without pause. With the military support of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, Franco managed to prevail after 3 years of brutal war. His victory marked the beginning of a dictatorship that would last for decades. Unlike the other two, his regime was more traditionalist than expansive, more Catholic than pagan, more military than theatrical. But he shared with them something essential: the conception of vertical power, of a hierarchical society, of a single truth imposed from above. Thus, the continent filled with these men of iron, each with their style, their speeches, their symbols. but united by one vision. Democracy was weak. Modernity brought decadence. The people had to be guided like a flock. In every case, propaganda played a central role. Internal enemies were created, Jews, communists, Masons, dissidents, to justify control. Past deeds were exalted to legitimize the present. Historical facts were altered to fit the narrative of power. Lies became politics, and politics became spectacle. And among these men, there was a disturbing pattern. They had all learned to read fear. They all understood that in times of crisis, the masses do not seek arguments, they seek certainties. That when dignity erodes, absolute solutions sound seductive. That the void of hope can be filled with hardened ideologies, wrapped in flags and marches. That collective pain, if channeled skillfully, can be transformed into obedience. What was coming was no longer a war of nations, but a clash of worldviews. Democracies stumbling before multiplying authoritarianisms. And behind every uniform, every embroidered emblem, every statue erected in crowded squares was the face of one of these men of iron. They did not arise from nowhere. They were made by fear, resentment, and a void of future. And once they took the reins, they made it clear they would not easily let go of the helm. Fire in Spain. Prelude to disaster. Spain, in the 1930s, was a cracked land. And not just because of lack of rain, although that too, but because of something deeper, harsher, more ancient, the fissures of its soul. Between the whitewashed walls of villages, in the cafes of cities, and in the fields where laborers worked tirelessly for a daily pittance, one could feel how the entire country creaked from within. It was not a new crack, nor even a surprise. For generations, Spain had been a territory where social inequality was not an anomaly, but an established rule. A country where land was concentrated in few hands, where the church dictated more than the state, and where modernity advanced like an uncomfortable visitor who was tolerated out of courtesy, but nobody invited to stay. The proclamation of the Second Republic, in April of 1931, was received with hopeful enthusiasm that swept across the country like a fresh wind. For the first time in a long while, tricolor flags waved in the squares, and people spoke openly of reforms, social justice, a new Spain, open, secular, and egalitarian. Women's suffrage was approved, agrarian reforms were planned, ambitious educational programs were promoted, and attempts were made to reduce the power of the church. But those steps, though celebrated by many, were perceived as threats by others. The landed nobility, the most conservative sectors of the army, religious elites, began to see in that republic not a promise of the future, but a threat to their world of privileges and traditional hierarchies. The tensions, which for years had been underground, emerged violently. Politics radicalized at a dizzying speed. While fascism began to show its teeth in Europe, polarization in Spain was already a daily routine. Attacks, strikes, political assassinations, church burnings, and repression, met with bloodshed, began to form part of the habitual landscape. The streets of Madrid, Seville, or Barcelona were not only passageways, but ideological trenches. There were neighborhoods where the names of certain parties could not be spoken. There were villages where the priest and the schoolteacher were mortal enemies. In that feverish climate, politics ceased to be debate and became a battlefield. On July 17, 1936, the military uprising against the Republic did not surprise those who had been watching the country's pulse for months. It was in Melilla where the first match was struck, and within hours the fire spread to other territories controlled by the army. What initially seemed like a quick and surgical coup transformed almost immediately into a civil war of ruthless ferocity. Spain split in two. On one side, the rebels, grouped under the command of General Francisco Franco, supported by conservative, monarchist, Carlist, and fascist sectors. On the other, the legitimate government of the Republic, backed by a complex amalgam of socialists, communists, anarchists, republicans, and regional nationalists. Each side fought not only for control of the state, but for incompatible visions of what the country should be. And both were willing to impose their project with blood. The Spanish Civil War was not simply a domestic conflict. It was, quite evidently, the first general rehearsal of what was about to explode in Europe. Foreign powers, who in theory had signed non-intervention agreements, became directly involved. Germany and Italy sent planes, weapons, advisors, and soldiers to the nationalist side. The Condor Legion, an elite unit of the Luftwaffe, bombed Republican cities such as Guernica, leaving behind a trail of death and destruction that horrified the world. It was a bombing with deliberate civilian targets, a strategy that would become the norm during the Second World War. Picasso's painting, harrowing and asymmetrical, turned that massacre into a symbol of the century. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union supported the Republic, although not selflessly. Stalin sent armament, technicians, and military commanders, but demanded ideological control of the conflict through the Communist Party. This generated internal tensions within the Republican side, where anarchists and Trotskyists deeply distrusted Stalinism. Fratricidal fights within the Republican faction weakened resistance and fragmented military capacity. And while democratic allies like France, the United Kingdom, and others remained on the sidelines, limited by their own internal fears, the Spanish battlefield became an experimental trench for the ideologies that would mark contemporary history. At a human level, the Civil War was a descent into hell. Repression was systematic on both sides. Executions, disappearances, purges, internment camps. The so-called walks, in which militiamen or phalangists took people from their homes to execute them without trial, became routine. In many cases, an anonymous denunciation or mere suspicion was enough to end with a bullet in the back of the neck against a wall. Intellectuals, teachers, peasants, priests, merchants. No one was safe. The conflict was not fought only on the fronts, but also in courtyards, sacristies, and classrooms. It was an intimate, cruel war that forgave no nuances. And amid that horror, gestures of humanity emerged that resisted dying. The international brigades, formed by volunteers from over 50 countries, came to Spain to defend the Republic. They were young, many without military experience, who felt that this war was not only a Spanish matter, but the first great confrontation between emerging fascism and threatened freedom. In their letters, which still remain, a heartbreaking idealism can be perceived. They knew they might die, but they were convinced they were fighting for something that transcended borders. Franco, however, advanced with relentless determination. His strategy was not speed, but attrition. A slow, methodical war with secure advances and no concessions. His figure grew as his enemies fell apart in internal disputes. As he occupied territory, he imposed a policy of punishment and purge. He sought not only military victory, but the total crushing of the ideological adversary. In the end, in 1939, after nearly 3 years of horror, and with more than 500,000 dead, Franco entered Madrid and ended the armed conflict. But what began as a war consolidated as a dictatorship. Spain was devastated, economically exhausted, socially broken, emotionally traumatized. The wounds did not heal. Thousands of families lived for decades without knowing the whereabouts of their loved ones. The post-war period was as harsh as the war itself. And although Franco proclaimed peace, what he established was a regime of surveillance, forced silence, and absolute control that lasted nearly 40 years. But the impact of the Civil War was not limited to the Iberian Peninsula. In Berlin and Rome, fascist leaders took note. The passivity of democracies, the effectiveness of propaganda, the potential of terror as a tool of control. The war in Spain was their testing ground, a kind of laboratory where they experimented without fear of retaliation. In Moscow, Stalin adjusted his strategy, understanding that he could influence foreign conflicts through ideology. And in Paris, London, and Washington, elites began to understand, although very late, that balance was illusory, that the storm was not only looming over Spain, but over the entire continent. The Spanish Civil War was, in many ways, the first great beat of a sick heart, a tragic prelude to an even darker symphony. The fire ignited in Madrid, in Guernica, in Teruel, did not go out with Franco's victory. It continued burning, hidden beneath diplomatic maps, until it finally exploded with devastating force. What happened in Spain was a warning, one the world refused to hear. Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the dance of the Pacts. In the carpeted halls of European chancelleries during those years before the war, the most common sound was not that of military boots, but of pens signing agreements that, although full of solemnity, carried in their lines a disturbing mix of fear, calculation, and resignation. It was the era of forced diplomatic smiles, group photos after tense negotiations, and toasts that concealed cracks. Europe danced on the edge of the abyss, pretending elegance, hiding vertigo, while Hitler fine-tuned his strategy with the precision of a ruthless watchmaker. The path to outbreak was neither abrupt nor sudden. It was a succession of measured steps, probing, pacts, and silences that made the inevitable easier. In March of 1938, the first piece fell without a single shot fired. The annexation of Austria, known as the Anschluss, was a surgical operation of propaganda, political pressure, and symbolic display. Hitler, born on Austrian soil, had always dreamed of uniting his native country with the Third Reich. For him, Austria was not an independent nation, but a detached part of the German homeland. His ambition was not secret. He had been repeating it with increasing intensity for years. The moment came when Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, weakened by internal pressure and the German military threat, found himself cornered. He tried to call a plebiscite to reaffirm independence, but Hitler did not allow it. He sent an ultimatum. German troops crossed the border. The Austrian government resigned, and within hours, the entire country was absorbed by Germany. There was no armed resistance. In the streets of Vienna, amid organized applause and uncertain glances, tanks paraded as if returning home. The international community watched the move with a mixture of astonishment and apathy. The United Kingdom and France, still marked by the trauma of the Great War, were not willing to intervene militarily over a border changed without violence. Hitler's argument, the union of German-speaking peoples, resonated in some sectors as reasonable. Some even believed that this could be the Führer's last move, a symbolic culmination rather than a step toward disaster. They clung to that illusion, ignoring that what had begun as propaganda was becoming imperial doctrine. But Hitler was not finished. His next target was more complex: Czechoslovakia, a young state created after the First World War, which combined within its territory diverse ethnicities and sensitivities. Within its borders lived a large German-speaking population concentrated in the Sudetenland region, in the west. For years, that community had maintained a contained tension with the central government in Prague, which tried to balance different cultures under a democratic administration, though politically dominated by the Czechs. Hitler used those tensions as an excuse. He supported the Sudeten German Party, fomented discontent, and began an international campaign denouncing supposed abuses against the German minority. In his speeches, he insisted that he had to protect his compatriots, even if they were beyond the border. Tension grew quickly. Unlike Austria, Czechoslovakia was an armed nation, with a modern army, a solid economy, and defensive alliances with France and the Soviet Union. If Hitler attacked, the consequences could be much more serious. But the Führer played a psychological chess game. He did not want to invade yet. He wanted to bend wills through fear. And he found them weakened. In London, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain firmly believed that avoiding war meant conceding, not challenging. his policy of appeasement was not simple cowardice. It was the conviction that the mistakes of 1914 should not be repeated. He thought that if Hitler was given what he demanded, control of the Sudetenland, Germany would calm down. That it was possible to stop the tiger by feeding it little by little. Thus, the Munich Conference was organized in September of 1938. It involved Germany, Italy, France, and the United Kingdom. The Czechoslovak government was not invited. The decision about its fate was made without its presence. It was one of the most humiliating diplomatic acts of the century. At Munich, it was agreed that Germany would annex the Sudetenland and that Czechoslovakia must cede it unconditionally. Chamberlain returned home announcing that he had secured peace for our time. He showed the paper signed with Hitler as if it were a talisman. The photo of that moment became a symbol of political self-deception. Because while cameras recorded his smile as he stepped off the plane, in Berlin the next move was already being planned. The cession of the Sudetenland was a mortal blow to Czechoslovakia. It not only lost a strategic region, full of fortifications, industries, and resources, but saw its internal cohesion fractured. The Slovak minority, seeing the weakness of the central government, began demanding autonomy. Hungary and Poland took advantage of the chaos to seize small border territories, and in March of 1939, without effective resistance, Hitler completed the total occupation. German troops entered Prague. The Czechoslovak state ceased to exist. It was no longer about protecting a German minority. This time, Hitler annexed a whole country that did not speak his language, had not requested him, and offered no pretext. The argument of ethnic reunification had run out. What remained was pure expansionism. The impact was devastating. France and the United Kingdom finally understood that Hitler had no limits, that pacts did not contain him, that every concession was interpreted as weakness rather than as a gesture of peace. Chamberlain, the same man who had waved his signed paper with messianic optimism, publicly admitted that appeasement had failed. Rearmament began. Military guarantees were sent to Poland, the next obvious target. But it was already too late. Hitler had gained time, territory, power, and prestige. He had shown that Europe could give in step by step while he advanced with firm steps. Meanwhile, darker pacts were woven away from cameras and ceremonial signatures. Stalin, who had watched Germany's growth with distrust, began weighing his options. The distrust between the Soviet Union and the Western powers was deep. Moscow felt marginalized in the negotiations. When the British and French sought to ally with him to stop Hitler, they did so slowly, with mistrust and diplomatic clumsiness. The calculating Soviet leader decided to look the other way. In August of 1939, he signed with Hitler the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, a non-aggression agreement that included secret clauses to divide Eastern Europe. The world shuddered. Two ideologically opposed regimes, who had attacked each other furiously in speeches, allied out of convenience. It was a marriage of ice. No one trusted anyone, but both saw an opportunity. Hitler secured his eastern rear to invade Poland without fear. Stalin gained time, territories, and freedom of movement in the Balkans and the Baltic. The dance of the Pacts had reached its climax. And while the leaders greeted each other with calculated gestures and frozen toasts, the peoples of Europe prepared, without fully knowing it, for the greatest catastrophe. Because with every signature, with every consented annexation, with every erased border, a moment approached when ink would no longer be enough, and weapons, bodies, and cities would seal the new map. Austria and Czechoslovakia were the first whispers of the roar. The pacts, the excuses, the concessions did not stop the disaster. They fed it with elegant indifference. Poland, the spark that ignited the world. By late summer of 1939, the map of Europe was a tension drawn with fragile lines. Borders seemed made of smoke, treaties of wet paper, and diplomatic commitments of intentions that shifted with the wind. But amid that unstable geography stood a fixed point, a country rebuilt with effort after centuries of partitions and foreign domination, found, unwillingly, at the very center of the storm. Poland. A land with deep roots, a complex history, and an identity forged through invasions and rebirths, it would become the stage for the opening crime of a war that would engulf the entire planet. In the days before tragedy, Warsaw was a city holding its breath. International diplomacy moved frantically. France and the United Kingdom, finally aware that Hitler would not stop by his own will, had solemnly guaranteed Polish independence. But those guarantees were more symbolic than effective. Polish leaders knew that if the Third Reich decided to attack, they would bear the first blow entirely alone. In Berlin, meanwhile, Hitler was finalizing the last details of a meticulously planned invasion. Operation Fall Weiss was no impulsive reaction. It was a machine prepared with military precision, an offensive combining speed, brutality, and propaganda. For weeks, German media had fed the narrative of constant provocations by Poland. Attacks were fabricated, border conflicts exaggerated, lies spread with the efficiency that had already become Nazi trademark. The goal was to justify aggression before domestic and international public opinion. The most notorious and cynical lie was the attack on the Gleiwitz radio station in Upper Silesia. There, German agents disguised as Polish soldiers staged a violent takeover of the facility, left bodies dressed in fake uniforms, and broadcast patriotic messages in Polish. It was a crude setup, but enough to serve as a casus belli. On September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein's guns opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte, near Gdansk. It was the formal first shot of World War II. At the same time, from the north, south, and west, the Wehrmacht began its advance at an inhuman speed that seemed impossible to stop. Luftwaffe fighters attacked train stations, refugee columns, and telephone lines. The concept of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was executed with a ferocity no one had anticipated. It was not only about defeating the military enemy. The goal was to break their spirit from the first moment, sow absolute chaos, and accelerate surrender through terror. The Polish army, though brave and willing, was disadvantaged in almost every way. Most units were infantry, lacking the motorization necessary to react quickly to German movements. Artillery was outdated, and the Air Force, though valiant, was largely destroyed in the attack's first days. Resistance was organized desperately. There were heroic clashes, like the defenders of Modlin, cavalry fighting hand-to-hand against mechanized divisions, and the stubborn defense of Warsaw. But the outcome was decided from the start. The Polish tragedy did not end with the German offensive. On September 17th, from the east, a second front opened. The Soviet Union, fulfilling the secret clauses of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, invaded Poland from the eastern border. The surprise was total. Stalin had waited for the right moment to pounce on his weakened prey. Moscow announced that the Soviet intervention aimed to protect Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities from the chaos of war. But the reality was harsher. Poland was divided between two powers that, though ideologically opposed, acted as accomplices of the same destruction. The Polish civilian population became a victim of two equally ruthless occupations. From the west, the Nazi machine imposed a regime of systematic repression. Intellectuals, religious leaders, state officials, artists, teachers, all were arrested, executed, or deported. The first massive deportations to concentration camps began just weeks later. In the East, Soviets applied their characteristic method: forced nationalization, mass arrests, deportations to Siberia. Thousands of Polish officers were murdered by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, in what later became known as the Katyn massacre, one of the conflict's most brutal crimes. Meanwhile, France and the United Kingdom, who had promised to defend Poland, declared war on Germany on September 3rd. It was a declaration loaded with solemnity, but lacking immediate action. For months, the Western Front remained still. What the French called la drôle de guerre, the phony war. Defenses were fortified, armies mobilized, but no significant offensive was launched to relieve pressure on the Poles. Poland was left to its fate. For Hitler, this was confirmation. He could continue expanding with a mix of force and audacity, knowing liberal democracies reacted more with words than deeds. The occupation of Poland marked the beginning of a prolonged tragedy. Over the following years, the country was used as a laboratory of Nazi brutality. The first ghettos were built there, ethnic cleansing policies implemented, and the most infamous extermination camps established. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, all born on Polish soil, all still carrying echoes of trains arriving loaded with lives destined for oblivion. The suffering of the Polish people during the war was not collateral damage. It was a central part of the Third Reich's ideological project. But there was also resistance. From the first days, clandestine networks formed, information cells, sabotage lines. The Polish state continued functioning in the shadows, with a government in exile and an impressive underground organization. The Armia Krajowa, or Home Army, operated throughout the occupation, and in 1944, it led the Warsaw Uprising, a desperate and heroic insurrection that, although ultimately crushed, became a symbol of dignity and fight against horror. Poland was, from day one, a testament to human capacity to endure the unbearable. It was the spark, yes, but also the mirror Europe should have looked into before it was too late. In its fields, streets, and razed villages, the first pages of a story were written that still hurt as it was being told. Because when the world exploded, it did so with Poland's name on everyone's lips, but with the resolve of very few. The spark that ignited the world briefly illuminated the willful blindness of those who thought horror could be avoided by looking the other way. And that spark, like all born from too long a friction, did not go out until it had burned everything. Blitzkrieg, the roar of the Wehrmacht. When the world still thought of war as a prolonged suffering in the trenches, a battle of attrition where lines barely moved and men fell by the thousands in static fights, Germany introduced a new form of combat that would forever change the way territories were conquered: the Lightning War. It was not a spontaneous invention, nor an improvised genius, but a strategy calculated down to the last detail, a brutal choreography of speed, surprise, and coordination. This method, known as Blitzkrieg, was not just a military tactic, it was a declaration of intent. And its first great demonstration, after the fierce trial in Poland, was the lightning that swept across half of Europe in a matter of months. The Wehrmacht, the name given to the German armed forces, was not simply a strengthened army. It was a machine designed with German precision to advance without stopping, to break defenses before the enemy even knew they were under attack, and to demoralize the civilian population while crushing regular troops. The heart of this strategy was not just tanks or bombers, though both played fundamental roles, but the absolute synchronization between armored units, motorized infantry, light artillery, and constant air support. Every move was thought of as a domino piece, knocking down the next. And when the first fell, the rest followed inevitably. In April 1940, after the deadly Polish experiment, Germany launched its offensive against Denmark and Norway. The operation was swift and surprising. Denmark barely resisted a day. Norway, more rugged and less accessible, offered greater opposition, but German air and naval superiority proved decisive. The reasons behind these moves went beyond territory. Hitler needed to secure strategic raw materials like Swedish iron ore passing through Norwegian ports, and guarantee safe maritime routes for the Kriegsmarine. The Allies, slow to respond, barely managed to resist before Oslo and other key cities fell. It was a warning, a signal the free world failed to read with enough urgency. But the true spectacle of Blitzkrieg began on May 10, 1940, when the Wehrmacht crossed the western border and attacked Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and above all, France. What seemed unthinkable happened with disconcerting speed. In just 6 weeks, one of the continent's most respected armies, the French, was outmaneuvered, divided, cornered, and defeated. The humiliation was total. The German plan, designed by General von Manstein, avoided the mistakes of World War I. Instead of attacking directly through northern France, as had been done decades before, the German forces feigned that path, pushing the Allies toward Belgium while the main force slipped through the Ardennes forest, an area French commanders considered impassable for heavy vehicles. There, the roar of the Wehrmacht became legend. Panzer tanks, accompanied by armed motorcyclists, troop-filled trucks, and Stuka dive bombers, carved a path like a river of steel. Instead of facing the enemy head-on, they encircled, isolated, and cut off communication and supplies. The French defensive lines, designed for another era, collapsed like houses of cards. The Maginot Line, the chain of fortifications France had proudly built, was easily bypassed. Germany didn't need to destroy it. They simply ignored it, going where they were least expected. In the Netherlands, resistance was brave, but insufficient. The bombing of Rotterdam, which destroyed much of the city and killed hundreds of civilians, forced an immediate surrender. It was part of the same pattern, a mixture of military efficiency and calculated terror. Belgium fell with equal speed. The German advance stunned the Allies. The speed was so overwhelming that often cities were taken before evacuation orders even arrived. Roads were filled with refugees, retreating soldiers, and abandoned vehicles. Chaos favored the invader. Every German column advancing sowed confusion, and that confusion was as deadly as bullets. In France, the situation became unbearable within days. The city of Sedan, a key point in the advance, fell after a devastating air attack. Resistance was minimal. From there, tanks spread in all directions, isolating the bulk of the French army and the British troops sent as support. It was in this context that the evacuation of Dunkirk occurred. Tens of thousands of soldiers were trapped on the northern coast, cornered between the sea and panzer divisions. But there, amid despair, an unexpected act of organization and courage unfolded. Hundreds of civilian boats, fishing vessels, pleasure craft, and warships crossed the English Channel to evacuate the surrounded soldiers. More than 300,000 men were rescued in a chaotic yet heroic operation. It was a retreat, yes, but also a seed of resistance. The war was not won for Germany, but France was, at least, lost. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris. The city, abandoned by its government and declared an open city to avoid destruction, was taken without a fight. Troops marched along the Champs-Élysées while the Nazi flag flew over official buildings. It was a symbolic image, designed to humiliate and terrorize. Just months earlier, no one would have imagined such a swift fall. France, the proud republic that had been a world reference in art, thought, and politics, was under occupation in weeks. The world held its breath. If France had fallen, what hope remained for the rest? The explanation did not lie solely in Germany's considerable material superiority, but in a different conception of war. While the Allied armies still thought in static, defensive terms, the Germans saw combat as a permanent offensive, non-stop, giving no time for the enemy to reorganize. The goal was not to face the enemy's best units directly, but to avoid, divide, encircle, and destroy them from within. Fear, surprise, and speed were weapons as important as cannons, and in the war's early years those weapons were unbeatable. But Blitzkrieg's success was not just a military achievement. it was also a psychological triumph. European peoples began to see the Wehrmacht as an unstoppable force. Stories of towns conquered in hours, entire armies surrounded in days, cities occupied without firing a single shot, spread like modern legends. Hitler presented himself as a strategic genius, an invincible leader defying the logic of old empires. And many, even outside Germany, began to believe it. The world faced something new, dark, and terrifying, and no one yet knew how to stop it. The roar of the Wehrmacht continued expanding across Europe, and each conquered country was not only a territorial victory, it was proof the world's balance had broken, that the rules of conflict had changed, that war had become a spectacle of accelerated destruction. It was a new era, one where time was no longer measured in years but in days, and the enemy did not knock on the door. It entered unannounced, like lightning in the night. Dunkirk, flight toward the future. At the end of May 1940, while Europe watched in horror as the relentless Wehrmacht advanced and the map transformed into a stage of Nazi victories multiplying at a staggering speed, a small point on the northern coast of France unexpectedly became the center of the world. Dunkirk. A modest port, better known to fishermen and cargo ships than for battles, turned from an ordinary coastal town into a symbol of survival, resistance, and uncertain fate. There, amid wet sands and smoking docks, one of the war's most intense and silent scenes unfolded. It was not a victory, yet it changed the course of history. Because sometimes, escaping in time can be braver than staying to die. The collapse of the French front had been so swift that even the Allied High Command initially failed to grasp the magnitude of the catastrophe. In a matter of days, over 300,000 British, French, and Belgian soldiers found themselves trapped, surrounded by German troops between the English Channel and the Panzer advance. The German armored divisions, led by generals like Guderian and Rommel, had slipped through the heart of northern France with astonishing speed, breaking lines, overcoming natural obstacles, and leaving the Allied armies completely divided. It was as if they had crossed a crack in time. The enemy was no longer in front of them. He was behind. What remained of the British Expeditionary Force, along with French and Belgian units, retreated toward the sea without clear structure, disorganized, harried by air raids, ambushes, and increasingly desperate news. On May 24th, when German tanks were just a few kilometers from Dunkirk, something happened that history still debates with a mix of surprise and confusion. Hitler ordered a halt to the advance. The exact reason remains disputed. Some say it was a tactical decision based on fear of getting bogged down in the marshy terrain. Others suggest Hermann Göring, eager to prove the Luftwaffe's power, convinced the Führer that the Air Force could finish off the Allies without moving more troops. Whatever the truth, that 3-day pause became an unexpected crack, a small chance amid the collapse. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, understood the gravity of the situation with a clarity his predecessors had never shown. Dunkirk was not just a tactical retreat, it was a matter of national survival. If those hundreds of thousands of soldiers were trapped or annihilated in France, the UK would be defenseless. It would no longer be merely a military defeat, but the beginning of the end. Aware of this, he immediately ordered the launch of an operation that defied traditional military logic. To rescue that entire army from hell, crossing the English Channel under enemy fire, with whatever vessels were available. It was the start of Operation Dynamo. What happened over the next 9 days was no conventional operation. It was a forced migration during wartime. The Royal Navy mobilized everything it had: destroyers, light cruisers, ferries. But it wasn't enough. So they called on civilians. Hundreds of private boats, from yachts and fishing vessels to pleasure barges, began sailing to the French coast. They went without protection, guarantees, or certainty. They went because there was an urgency beyond comprehension. The channel, usually rough and treacherous, became for a few days a fragile bridge between despair and hope. On Dunkirk's beaches, the scene was apocalyptic. Columns of black smoke rose from constant bombing. The roar of Stukas sounded like the buzzing of fate. Thousands of soldiers waited in line, shoulder to shoulder, with the sea on one side and the enemy approaching by land. Some were wounded. Others had gone days without food or sleep. Yet there they stood, formed, disciplined, waiting their turn to board as if an army still stood behind them. The evacuation took place under extreme conditions. With the docks destroyed, men often had to walk into the water and swim to the boats. Overloaded British pilots fought in the skies to keep the Luftwaffe at bay. It was an improvised choreography between sky and sea, a desperate symphony of escape. Days passed, and the operation continued, surpassing all initial expectations. 40,000 soldiers were expected to be rescued, but the number grew every hour. More than 330,000 were saved. It was literally a miraculous salvation. But it was also a painful spectacle. Much military equipment was left behind. Guns, tanks, ammunition, vehicles, supplies. The British Army returned empty-handed. Even more important, thousands of French soldiers stayed to hold the enemy and cover the retreat. Many were captured or died in combat. Dunkirk was a successful retreat, but at a very high cost. Despite everything, when Churchill spoke to Parliament on June 4, 1940, he did not celebrate victory. He delivered one of history's most remembered speeches, warning that wars are not won by evacuations. He was honest. But he also planted something desperately needed: determination. He spoke of fighting on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, on the hills. It was not empty rhetoric. It was a declaration of total resistance. Because at that moment, the United Kingdom was utterly alone. Western Europe had fallen under the yoke of the Third Reich. What was saved at Dunkirk was not just an army. It was the possibility to keep fighting. It was the idea that even when all seems lost, there is still a chance to act. In retrospect, Dunkirk was not a military victory. It was a flight. But it was, in its own way, a flight toward the future. Because without it, there would have been no British defense, no resistance, no hope. It was a turning point without epic parades or flags flying, but with a symbolic strength only time has amplified. It was proof that courage does not always show itself by advancing, but by enduring long enough to try again. That fog-covered, smoke-wreathed, ruin-strewn port became the threshold of something greater. Because though Europe seemed lost, and the world leaned toward darkness, in that corner of history a small, stubborn, silent flame remained lit. A flame that, in time, would become fire. London burns. The Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, with continental Europe under the heel of the Third Reich, and Nazi flags flying over Paris, Brussels, and Amsterdam, it seemed the world was tilting toward a shadow that engulfed everything. Hitler had triumphed through a combination of speed, fear, and precision. But one adversary remained standing, an enemy surrounded by the sea and held up by a will that couldn't be bombed away so easily. The United Kingdom, isolated but steadfast, became the last bastion against a growing hegemony with every border crossed. And then, when invasion seemed imminent, the sky above the British Isles turned into a battlefield. The Battle of Britain was no trench war, no amphibious assault. It was a fight of wings and engines, of radar and night flights, of cities burning while their people sought shelter underground. It was the first major battle fought entirely in the air, and one of the most decisive of the entire war. Its outcome not only prevented a Nazi invasion but marked a turning point. It proved Hitler could be stopped. The German plan was clear. To invade the islands, first their air capability had to be destroyed. Without control of the skies, no landing was possible. Thus was born Operation Sea Lion, a strategy utterly dependent on the Luftwaffe's success. Hermann Göring, commander of the German Air Force, promised to crush the Royal Air Force in weeks. He was confident in the numerical and technological superiority of his squadrons and openly scorned the British ability to withstand sustained attack. But he was wrong. From mid-July to late October 1940, day after day, the British skies filled with metallic buzz. Squadrons of Messerschmitt fighters escorted formations of Heinkel, Dornier, and Junkers bombers crossing the Channel with a single objective: to wipe out air bases, airfields, radar stations, and cities. The goal was to collapse Britain's air defense and force the country to surrender from the skies. What they did not expect was a defense system that was organized, flexible, and fiercely determined. The Royal Air Force, despite being outnumbered, had carefully prepared its response. It wasn't just courage, but engineering, planning, and technology. The coastal radar chain allowed early detection of enemy bombers before crossing the Channel, giving British pilots precious minutes to scramble and confront them. The Spitfire and Hurricane fighters, fewer in number, were exceptional combat machines, fast, maneuverable, capable of dogfighting the German planes. And most importantly, they fought on home turf. A British pilot shot down fell over his own territory and could return to battle. A captured German pilot became a prisoner. The sky became a deadly dance. Hour by hour, dozens of air battles erupted over the southern coasts, the fields of Kent, and the cliffs of Dover. People on the ground watched those tiny figures flash like lightning between clouds and sun, leaving smoke trails that marked the duels. It was a spectacle without music, but full of tension. Civilians learned to distinguish the sounds of planes, to tell the deep engine of a Heinkel from the sharper roar of a Spitfire. Every whistle, every explosion was a message from the sky. As days passed, Göring changed strategy. Facing unexpected resistance, he decided to attack the heart of the population, the cities. London became the main target. On September 7th, what would be known as the Blitz began. Massive, prolonged bombings aimed at breaking the morale of the capital's inhabitants. Night after night, sirens sounded and people descended into subway stations converted into makeshift shelters. While incendiary and high-caliber bombs fell above, families slept shoulder to shoulder in the depths, wrapped in blankets, prayers, and whispered songs to soothe the children. For nearly 2 months, London burned. Buckingham Palace was hit, as was the House of Commons. Entire neighborhoods vanished under rubble. But something strange happened. Morale did not break. Despite the suffering and losses, the spirit of Londoners grew stronger. The image of Churchill walking through bombed zones, smoking his cigar, flashing the V for Victory sign, became a symbol of resistance. Every destroyed home was a reason to rebuild. Every victim a symbol of something greater. The Luftwaffe unwittingly strengthened what it sought to destroy. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force kept fighting. The pilots were young, many barely 20 years old. Some came from British colonies, others from Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Canada, having come to give their lives for a common cause. Squadrons reorganized daily. Losses were constant. Rest was scarce. But courage was unbreakable. Churchill, with a cruel poetry that sometimes came naturally, described them with words that would echo through generations. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Finally, in October, the attacks began to lessen. The Luftwaffe had suffered more losses than it could replace. Air resistance had not broken, and preparations for a land invasion were considered unfeasible. Operation Sea Lion was postponed and then scrapped. Hitler, frustrated, turned his gaze eastward. England had survived, not through numerical superiority or invulnerable armor, but through conviction, tactical intelligence, and the people's capacity to stand firm even as the sky burned. The Battle of Britain was, in many ways, a silent turning point. It was not won by territorial gains nor celebrated with triumphant parades. It was a battle of attrition, smoke, rubble, and held breath. A battle where every night could be the last, but every dawn was a new chance. And when the smoke finally cleared, the world understood that the United Kingdom would not be easily subdued. It had faced the most feared war machine of the moment, and stood tall. London, wrapped in ashes and memory, had not fallen. And that small detail changed the course of the war, because as long as England lived, the flame of resistance would stay lit. And with it, hope. The sands of North Africa. The desert is a silent, relentless beast. It forgives no distraction, admits no mistakes. In its endless stretch of dunes, shifting with the wind and skies that boil by day and freeze by night, everything seems on the edge of illusion. Yet it was there, in that almost supernatural setting, where World War II opened one of its strangest, most intense, and decisive fronts. The North African Campaign. A war without jungles, without ruined cities, without skies clouded by industrial smoke, but just as fierce. A war fought in the vastness of sand, under a killing sun, between dusty oases and strategic coasts. A war where dust mixed with gunpowder and armored vehicles roared like lost animals caught in an endless storm. It all began with an empire trying to appear stronger than it was. Benito Mussolini, a convinced fascist and boundlessly ambitious, looked enviously at Hitler's military successes in Europe. While the Führer gained victories and territories, Italy stayed on the conflict's sidelines, which was unacceptable to Mussolini. Convinced the Italian machine could restore Rome's glory, he ordered in September 1940 his troops stationed in Libya to cross the border into Egypt, then under British control. What he did not foresee was that he was triggering a chain of events beyond his control, because the desert, that seemingly empty land, would soon become one of the war's most contested arenas. The British response was swift. From bases in Egypt and with the strategic backing of the Suez Canal, a vital artery of the British Empire, the Allies organized a counter-offensive that pushed the Italians hundreds of kilometers westward. It was a quick, clean, devastating blow. The Italian expeditionary force proved weak, poorly equipped, and badly led. And at that moment, facing the risk of total humiliation, Hitler intervened. He sent General Erwin Rommel, one of his brightest commanders, along with a contingent of German troops known as the Afrika Korps. The war in North Africa took on a new dimension. It was no longer Mussolini's colonial folly, but a strategic fight with global implications. Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox by his enemies, showed exceptional tactical skill from the start. He understood the terrain, used it to his advantage, and his moves were unpredictable, fast, almost choreographed. His command style was direct, close, and daring. He wasn't the kind of general who gave orders from the rear. He often stayed near the front, watching through binoculars, tracing advance routes in the sand. With just a few divisions and an always uncertain supply line, he took Tobruk, a crucial fortress on the Libyan coast, and pushed deep into Egypt. His ultimate goal? Alexandria and beyond, the Suez Canal. Controlling that sea route meant strangling British communications with India, Australia, and the rest of Asia. A masterstroke, but the desert favored neither side. Sand invaded everything. It clogged engines, rusted weapons, blinded gunners, erased roads. Distances were huge, logistics fragile. Every advance had to be calculated with obsessive precision. A failure to supply water could mean the death of an entire unit. Battles were long, and the enemy was often invisible until dangerously close. There were no mountains or rivers to serve as borders, just open space where every decision could change everything. The British, aware of the threat Rommel posed, sent reinforcements from across the empire. Australian, New Zealander, Indian, and South African troops, an army made up of different cultures, languages, and accents, united by a common cause. They faced a tenacious enemy but also a brutal climate. Sandstorms could last hours, disorienting even the most experienced. Engines overheated. Water rations were measured with monastic discipline. Sleeping under the stars was as beautiful as it was dangerous. War there was unlike anything else. The fight for Tobruk was one of the African front's most intense episodes. For more than 8 months, Axis forces tried to retake the city after its initial loss, facing stubborn defense from Australian and British troops. The siege, more psychological than militarily effective, became a symbol of resistance. Rommel needed it as part of his supply chain. The Allies defended it as a strategic and moral trench. Eventually, the Africa Corps took it, but at a high cost and without consolidating their momentum toward Egypt. Then another key figure appeared on the desert stage, Bernard Montgomery. Appointed commander of the British Eighth Army, Montgomery lacked Rommel's spontaneous charisma, but had an analytical, methodical, and persevering mind. His approach was opposite: prepare thoroughly, accumulate resources, wear down the enemy. He didn't seek spectacular blows, but solid victory. In October 1942, on the sands of El Alamein, he launched an offensive that would become the beginning of the end for Axis troops in Africa. The Second Battle of El Alamein was a titanic clash of wills. For days, German and Italian defenses withstood waves of attacks. But Montgomery had superiority in men, tanks, artillery, and above all, fuel. Rommel, increasingly weakened, began to retreat. It was the first major setback suffered by the once invincible Desert Fox. The Allied advance was steady, if slow, chasing Axis forces through northern Libya until reaching Tunisia again. At the same time, from the west, Anglo-American troops landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch. It was the final encirclement. In a few months, Axis forces were trapped between two fronts. The geography that once gave them advantage now became a prison. In May 1943, the North African campaign officially ended with the surrender of over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers. It was the Allies' first great land victory. Africa had become the springboard to Europe. From there, plans for the invasion of Italy and later the entire continent would begin. The Desert Front, sometimes overshadowed by the drama of Stalingrad or the heroism of Normandy, was essential in breaking the myth of Nazi invincibility. There, they learned to fight differently. There, it was shown that organized resistance, logistical control, and international cooperation could overcome even the most skilled tactical genius. And above all, there it was proven that war, disguised in glory or strategy, remained a raw, dirty, deeply human struggle, fought at the planet's extremes. The sands of North Africa still hold the remnants of that conflict. Rifles buried under meters of dust, helmets rusted by salty wind, maps forgotten in hastily dug shelters. It is a landscape that speaks silently, remembers without words, burns like the midday sun, but somehow also marks the moment the world began to realize the monster could be beaten, even if it was among dunes, even if it was on the edge of the abyss, even if it was with cracked lips from thirst and eyes full of dust. Operation Barbarossa, the Russian winter. In the early days of summer 1941, while much of Europe lay under the domination of the Third Reich, and the war news seemed to repeat with terrifying monotony, one German victory after another falling like dominoes, Adolf Hitler made a decision that would forever change the course of history. A colossal, reckless choice, charged with ideology and imperial ambition, to launch a massive invasion against the Soviet Union. It was an all-in bet, a roll of the dice on a board that already seemed his, yet still held surprises. The operation was codenamed Barbarossa, evoking the medieval German emperor, who once marched east on a crusade. But what was about to begin would not be a chivalrous campaign, but a massacre of colossal proportions, a war without moral or strategic limits, and finally, a brutal encounter with an enemy that did not surrender even when the ice broke their bones. The German plan was deliriously ambitious: to attack along a front nearly 3,000 kilometers long, crush the Red Army before it could organize, seize the main Soviet cities, Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev, in a single encircling movement, and provoke the total collapse of the communist regime within months. Hitler believed the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, an ideological experiment without real foundations, held up by fear and propaganda. He thought it was enough to push the doors open and the giant would collapse. What he ignored or refused to accept was that beneath the surface, the Soviet people's capacity for resistance was denser and deeper than any German general could calculate. On June 22, 1941, at 4 a.m, the offensive began. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by units from Finland, Hungary, Romania, and Italy, crossed the border. It was the largest land assault in history. The Luftwaffe destroyed hundreds of Soviet planes on the ground in the first hours. Panzer divisions advanced like sharp blades, slicing the enemy into uncontrollable segments. The surprise was total. Stalin, despite multiple warnings, had ignored the signs. When the invasion started, the Soviet dictator was paralyzed for days. The Soviet command apparatus, decapitated by the purges of the 30s, reacted with disorganization, and the front collapsed with alarming ease. During the first weeks, the war seemed like an expanded repetition of the Blitzkrieg model. German forces penetrated deep into Soviet territory, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners, surrounding entire armies, seizing key cities. Kiev fell, Minsk fell, Smolensk fell. Each day of advance was presented in Berlin as confirmation of German superiority. But behind that surface of success, two fundamental details lurked that would change the operation's fate. The first was logistical. The front was too vast. Roads deteriorated under the weight of vehicles, supplies were delayed, and fuel began to run low. The second, more serious, was human. The Soviets, far from collapsing, were starting to harden. As the German army pushed into the vast Russian plains, the Soviets implemented a scorched earth strategy. Factories were dismantled and moved east, out of enemy reach. Towns were burned before being abandoned. Bridges were blown up. Nothing was left for the invader. The enemy advanced, yes, but behind him lay an empty, hostile, useless territory. At the same time, the Red Army began regrouping. Millions of men and women were mobilized, old officers reactivated, new weapons introduced. The number of Soviet tanks was much higher than Germany had anticipated, and their resistance much fiercer. Fighting began to harden. The fast war was slowly becoming a war of attrition. One of the campaign's main objectives was Moscow. By late September, German troops launched Operation Typhoon, aiming to take the capital before winter arrived. It was a fierce offensive, with significant gains. Panzer divisions came within less than 30 kilometers of the city. But then, as if the country itself started to defend, the cold came. A brutal, sudden, relentless cold. Temperatures dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Snow-covered roads, mud turned to ice, tank engines stopped working, German soldiers began dying of hypothermia. The German army uniforms were not designed for the Russian winter. The High Command's arrogance had led them to ignore one of military history's oldest lessons: never underestimate the steppe's climate. Napoleon learned it in 1812, and now Hitler was paying again. Rifles malfunctioned, weapons froze in hands, boots cracked in the frost's stiffness. Meanwhile, the Soviets, accustomed to winter and better equipped, launched a counteroffensive. For the first time in the war, German forces began significant retreats. Moscow did not fall, and with that failure, the illusion of invincibility was broken. The war in the East was unconventional. It was ideological, total, without limits. Hitler had defined the campaign as a struggle of extermination, ordering the laws of war be ignored. Soviet political commissars were executed instantly, civilian populations repressed with unprecedented brutality, and Jewish communities systematically eliminated by death squads known as Einsatzgruppen. Mass graves multiplied. Mobile concentration camps left a trail of corpses. It was a war conceived not only to conquer territory, but to redesign the world's demographics. But something happened that Hitler could not foresee. Soviet resistance, far from weakening before terror, grew stronger. The Soviet Union began mobilizing its entire industrial capacity. In the Urals, factories produced tanks and ammunition day and night. Trains never stopped moving. And above all, the Russian people, battered, humiliated, and persecuted by their own regime for decades, united in a common effort to stop the invader. Not for Stalin, not for communism, but for their land, their families, their survival. When the first winter ended, the Red Army was still standing. Moscow had not fallen. Leningrad, besieged for months, still resisted under a constant rain of bombs and hunger. Hitler had failed in his attempt to annihilate his enemy in a single campaign, and the Eastern Front became, from that moment on, an endless hell. An open trench thousands of kilometers long where every meter was gained with blood. The Blitzkrieg was dead in the Russian snow. What began was something else. A war of attrition, of years, of millions of dead. And no longer was Germany the one setting the pace. It was winter. It was Russia. It was the beginning of the end. Pearl Harbor, the giant Awakens. The Pacific Ocean, with its endless vastness and islands scattered like fragments from another world, seemed in the early 1940s a distant extension of the great conflict shaking Europe. It was a scene of apparent calm, a liquid border between colonial empires, strategic trade routes, and ambitions that until then had been masked by treaties, diplomatic exchanges, and silent power plays. But beneath the surface of that sea, between tropical gleams and naval bases hidden among palm trees, a storm was brewing. Because while in the frozen lands of the East Hitler's armies were freezing before Moscow, on the other side of the world, another power was preparing to change the global balance with an attack as precise as it was devastating: Japan. The Japanese Empire was no ordinary nation on the 20th century political map. It was an ancient civilization that, in just a few decades, had undergone a swift transformation from feudalism to militarized modernity. With a powerful industrial economy and an ideology mixing samurai tradition, ultranationalism, and a messianic sense of racial superiority, Japan had become an expansionist power. From the early 1930s, it began advancing through continental Asia, invading Manchuria in 1931, and later unleashing an open war against China in 1937. Its goal was clear: to dominate East Asia, control the region's natural resources, and become the center of a new Eastern order. But that path was full of obstacles. The United States, with its economic interests in the Philippines, its bases across the Pacific, and its commercial influence throughout the region, represented a direct threat to Japan's imperial project. Though officially neutral during the early years of the European War, the US was slowly but firmly positioning itself on the Allies' side. Economic sanctions imposed by Washington, especially asset freezes and oil embargoes, were choking Japan's ambitions. And then, amid this growing isolation, Tokyo's top military commanders decided to gamble on a strategy that, while risky, seemed indispensable. A preemptive strike against the US Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The planning was meticulous, almost surgical. Under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's command, the attack was conceived not as a traditional declaration of war, but as a lightning strike designed to destroy the US Navy's capacity before it could react. Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and knew American military culture well, was aware of the risk. He knew that if the blow was not decisive, it would awaken a fury that Imperial Japan might not contain. But his voice, though respected, was not enough to stop the plan. Fate was already sealed. The morning of December 7, 1941, began in Hawaii like any other. The sky was clear, the waters calm, and the Sunday routine wrapped Pearl Harbor Naval Base in a false sense of peace. Sailors had breakfast, planes rested in their hangars, and battleships, lined up like steel statues, gleamed under the tropical sun. Then, without warning, the roar of engines tore through the air. Over 300 Japanese planes descended in formation from the north, like a swarm trained to kill. The attack was so swift that, in the first minutes, many soldiers thought it was a military exercise. Bombs began to fall with devastating precision. The USS Arizona, hit by an internal explosion caused by a bomb that penetrated its deck, broke in two and sank within minutes, taking more than 1,000 sailors with it. The USS Oklahoma was flipped like a toy by aerial torpedoes. Other battleships and cruisers were damaged or destroyed. Hangars burned, planes exploded before they could take off. Chaos took over the harbor. Fire spread across the docks. Smoke rose like a black curtain covering the sun. In less than 2 hours, Japan had dealt a brutal blow. More than 2,400 Americans died. Almost the entire Pacific Fleet was rendered unusable, at least temporarily. And although some U.S. aircraft carriers, which were on missions outside the base, survived, the psychological impact was profound. The most powerful nation in the Americas had been attacked without warning, on its own territory. The myth of invulnerability was broken. The reaction was immediate. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered a speech to Congress that would be etched in history. He defined the attack as a date which will live in infamy. And with that phrase, he marked the official entry of the United States into World War II. Congress declared war on Japan almost unanimously. Germany and Italy, Japan's allies through the Tripartite Pact, responded by declaring war on the U.S. days later. Within hours, the conflict ceased to be regional and became, without return, a truly global war. But what happened after Pearl Harbor was not only a geographic expansion of the conflict, it was the awakening of a sleeping giant, an industrial, military, and human machine that would forever change the scale of the confrontation. The United States, with its capacity for mass production, mobilized population, and rising technology, began transforming immediately. Car factories converted into tank and aircraft assembly lines, women assuming jobs in key industrial sectors, widespread recruitment, fleets built in record time, and logistic networks spanning oceans. The giant had awakened, and it would do so with a determination its enemies had not fully anticipated. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, Japan continued to rack up victories. It took Hong Kong, invaded the Philippines, advanced into the Dutch East Indies, Malaysia, and Burma. It seemed unstoppable. But every step it took pushed it further beyond its capacity to sustain the empire it was creating. Because while imperial soldiers marched through the jungle, the factories of Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles worked nonstop. And beyond bombs and military strategies, the United States began forging something its enemies could not replicate: a collective will of total resistance. Pearl Harbor was not just an attack, it was a monumental strategic mistake. Because although it caused devastating initial damage, it failed to break the spirit of its victim. It strengthened it. It united a divided country, consolidated Roosevelt's figure as a war leader, and transformed a distant conflict into a national cause. From that day, calendars began marking time with a different rhythm. The Pacific was no longer an ocean of commerce and diplomacy. It had become a battlefield without limits. And on that new map, everything was yet to be written. With fire, with steel, with blood. Because the giant had not only awakened, It was furious, and it remembered. The Pacific Ablaze. After the thunder of Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Ocean ceased to be just a stretch of water dotted with islands and transformed into the largest, wildest, and most unpredictable stage of the Second World War. In that liquid arena, where the distance between one battle and the next could be measured in thousands of kilometers, a war unfolded that seemed designed by nature itself to push the will of men to the limit. There were no stable fronts or trench lines. Instead, invisible aircraft carriers floated, silent submarines prowled, bombers took off from forgotten atolls, and Marines advanced meter by meter through jungles and coral reefs, on islands few knew how to locate on a map, but which would become charged with an almost mystical symbolism. Japan, strengthened after its surprise attack, began in 1942 an expansion that seemed unstoppable. It advanced at a speed that defied all logistical logic, seizing Guam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Burma, the Solomon Islands, the Dutch East Indies, and a long series of strategic archipelagos in the Central Pacific. The empire of the rising sun had reached colossal proportions, and its propaganda proclaimed it the creator of an Asian co-prosperity sphere, a rhetorical formula that sought to justify its dominance as a liberation from Western colonialism. But behind that facade lay a ruthless occupation, systematic massacres, forced labor, brutal repression, and a firm belief in Japanese superiority that fueled an almost ritual violence against everything foreign or rebellious. However, while the tide seemed completely favorable to Japan, the United States began to reorganize its forces, not only in terms of armament and strategy, but also in mindset. The war in the Pacific would be unlike anything American soldiers had faced before. It was not Europe. It was not bombed cities or recognizable battlefields. Here, the jungle was the enemy, the climate was the enemy, the sea was the enemy, and above all, the human enemy fought with a disconcerting intensity. Japanese soldiers, educated in an almost religious vision of duty, were trained to die rather than surrender. The Bushido Code, the ancient samurai code, mixed with modern ultranationalism to produce a war psychology that defied all principles of conventional warfare. The first major shock that reversed the course of the conflict was the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. There, for the first time in naval history, enemy ships never saw each other directly. It was an entirely aerial battle, fought by fighters and bombers launched from aircraft carriers. Although the outcome was technically a draw, the Japanese fleet had to withdraw from its attempt to invade Port Moresby in New Guinea. It was a warning, a sign that the balance was beginning to falter. But the true turning point came a month later, in the waters near a tiny island called Midway. The Battle of Midway, fought in June 1942, was a turning point. With precise naval intelligence and a considerable dose of fortune, the United States anticipated the Japanese move and launched a devastating attack against their fleet. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the very core of their offensive power, were sunk over the course of a few days. The victory, achieved thanks to codebreakers, dive bomber pilots, and the determination of a fleet still rebuilding, changed the tone of the war. From then on, Japan adopted a more defensive posture, while the United States began a slow, bloody but inexorable offensive. The American strategy was based on a maneuver known as island hopping. It consisted of capturing a series of key islands, one by one, surrounding others deemed less important, and thus building a chain of bases that allowed the gradual approach to the Japanese archipelago. But none of these conquests was easy. Each island was defended to the last man. Every meter of sand cost dozens of lives. The beaches were deadly traps. Reefs cut propellers. Mangroves hid snipers. The harshest example was Guadalcanal, where fighting lasted 6 months under extreme climatic and sanitary conditions. Malaria, hunger, and heat were as deadly as bullets. As the United States Marines advanced, other large-scale battles marked the brutality of the Pacific theater. At Tarawa, Japanese defenders resisted until they were completely annihilated. At Saipan, thousands of civilians committed suicide by throwing themselves off cliffs, convinced by imperial propaganda that the Americans would torture them. At Leyte, the largest naval battle in modern history took place, with hundreds of ships facing each other in a colossal game of strategy. And at Iwo Jima, the capture of a volcanic island cost the lives of nearly 7,000 American soldiers and more than 20,000 Japanese. The photograph of Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi became an iconic image, but behind that frozen moment was one of the fiercest battles of the entire war. The conflict in the Pacific was not only fought with weapons, it was also a war of symbols. The capture of each island represented both a physical and psychological conquest. The message was clear. The American advance was unstoppable, and the noose around Japan was tightening. But despite defeats, surrender was not among the options considered by Japanese leaders. On the contrary, desperation began to produce more extreme tactics. It was then that a figure emerged who would define the final stage of the conflict: the kamikaze pilot. These young men, many barely trained, were instructed to become human projectiles. They flew their planes loaded with explosives directly into enemy ships, with the sole intention of sinking or irreparably damaging them. It was an act of voluntary death, full of rituals, ceremonies, farewell letters. It was also a sign of the ideological collapse beginning to occur within Imperial Japan. When the only resource is to turn your own soldiers into living missiles, defeat is no longer a distant possibility. It is a fate to be postponed with blood. At the same time, bombings over Japanese cities intensified. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Hiroshima, names that would later resonate with historical weight, were already beginning to suffer the consequences of total war. B-29 airplanes, capable of flying very high and carrying tons of bombs, reduced entire neighborhoods to ashes. The nights lit up with fire. The civilian population, trapped between obedience to the emperor and fear of annihilation, began to understand that the world they knew was crumbling beneath their feet. The Pacific, which at first was a sea conquered by surprise, became a widespread hell. There were no truces, no winters to pause the fight, no clear borders. It was a war where the enemy could appear from the sky, from the sea, or from beneath the water. A war where willpower and strategy faced off on equal terms with the blind resistance of fanaticism and absolute loyalty to duty. When the sun set behind the palm trees, the shadows were long, and smoke floated like a veil over the waters. The entire Pacific seemed to burn. It was not only real fire. It was the fire of hatred, fear, accumulated revenge, and power that no longer hid itself. In that setting, as the waves crashed against the silent shores of new islands to conquer, the longest, bitterest, and most symbolic chapter of modern war was being woven. And the end, although already beginning to show, was still wrapped in a distant glow, too bright not to hurt. Holocaust, the silence of the world. At the heart of the Second World War, while maps were dyed red and blue with strategies and offensives, while newspapers spoke of fronts, alliances, epic battles, and decorated generals, a parallel tragedy unfolded away from the headlines, in the shadow of military convoys, behind fiery speeches and glorified conquests. It was a tragedy without uniforms or trenches, one that was not fought with rifles on open fields, but with lists, with trains, with barbed wire, with bureaucratic words and orders signed from cold desks. That tragedy was the Holocaust. And for years the world that watched, calculated, and spoke of peace and war, remained silent. Since the rise of Adolf Hitler to power in 1933, the German Jewish community, one of the most integrated in Europe, educated, cosmopolitan, with centuries of history on the continent, was systematically singled out as the internal enemy that had to be monitored, isolated, and ultimately eliminated. Anti-Semitism, which had existed in Europe for centuries, sometimes disguised as religious hatred and other times as nationalism, was transformed by the Nazi regime into a state doctrine. Jews ceased to be simply a social or political problem and came to be defined as a biological threat, an infection within the body of the nation. This view, supported by an aberrant pseudoscience, fueled the entire racial policy of the Third Reich. At first, the exclusion mechanism was gradual, disguised as legality. The Nuremberg Laws, enacted in 1935, stripped Jews of their civil rights, forbade them from marrying non-Jewish Germans, expelled them from public jobs, universities, and liberal professions. Their businesses were boycotted, their assets confiscated, their names removed from official records. The Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938, marked a breaking point. Thousands of synagogues, shops, and homes were destroyed throughout Germany and Austria. Dozens of people died, and more than 30,000 were detained and sent to concentration camps. What was once executed with papers began to be done with fire. When the war began in 1939, the persecution process took on a new dimension. With the occupation of Poland, and later other areas of Eastern Europe, the Nazi regime found itself in control of millions of Jews. They were no longer thousands, they were entire populations. At this point, the machinery of hatred stopped thinking about exclusion and began thinking about elimination. Ghettos were created, closed neighborhoods where Jewish communities were forced to live in inhuman conditions, without potable water, with minimal food rations, no heating, no medicine. The Warsaw Ghetto came to hold more than 400,000 people crowded together, living between misery and despair, while life outside its walls continued. But the real leap into the abyss occurred in 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union. There, in the Eastern Territories, the Third Reich applied its ethnic cleansing project with brutal, unmasked cruelty. Special groups called Einsatzgruppen accompanied the regular army and received direct orders to systematically eliminate Jews, Roma, communists, and anyone considered undesirable. Their method was simple and monstrous. Gather the population, force them to dig pits, line them up next to the pits, and shoot them. Day after day, at the edge of forests, on village outskirts, gunshots echoed like metronomes of genocide. At Babi Yar, near Kiev, more than 30,000 people were killed in just 2 days, and that was only one episode among thousands. But even that was not enough for the regime's perverse logic. Execution by shooting was costly, psychologically inefficient for the soldiers themselves, and not very industrial. It was then that what the Nazis called the final solution began to take shape: the systematic, planned, and mechanized extermination of European Jews. In January 1942, during the Wannsee Conference, high-ranking regime officials gathered in an elegant villa on the shores of a lake discussed the technical details of the genocide. The tone was administrative, dispassionate, almost bureaucratic. They spoke of evacuations, relocations, and special treatments, but the words were masks. What was being discussed there was how to kill millions of people in the fastest and most efficient way possible. Thus were born the extermination camps: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek, Chelmno. They were not labor camps, like Dachau or Buchenwald. They were death factories. The logic was direct. Trains arrived. Prisoners were selected on the ramp, those not useful for forced labor. The elderly, women with children, the sick, were sent directly to gas chambers. Zyklon B was used, a pesticide designed to kill within minutes. Then came the stripping. Gold teeth were extracted, hair was cut, bodies were burned in crematoria that operated day and night. It was a system that sought to erase every trace, to leave no memory. Auschwitz became the absolute symbol of that machinery. More than 1 million people died there. Most were Jewish, but also Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, political opponents. Those who survived did so amid disease, torture, inhuman medical experiments, and constant hunger that made each day a countdown. The testimonies that emerged after the war, from those who managed to survive, speak of an inverted world, where humanity turned to ash, and where the only law was horror. And while all this happened, the world remained silent. Some reports leaked by diplomats, members of the resistance, fugitives escaping the camps, reached Allied hands. It was known that something terrible was happening. There were talks of mass executions, inhuman conditions, inexplicable disappearances. But the real dimension of the genocide was, for a long time, ignored, underestimated, or considered just another rumor in the fog of war. There were no strategic bombings of Auschwitz. There were no coordinated campaigns to stop the trains. There were no urgent speeches warning the world population of what was underway. The silence, voluntary or not, was part of the crime. The Holocaust was not an accident, nor a momentary madness. It was an ideological project carried out coldly, methodically, and with technology. It was the ultimate expression of an ancient hatred granted absolute power. It was a warning disguised as history. And its echoes still resonate. Because among the numbers, 6 million Jews murdered, millions of additional victims among Roma, people with disabilities, homosexuals, political opponents. There are names, voices, entire families that disappeared, leaving nothing more than a photograph, a letter, a yellow star sewn on a jacket. And all that happened while the trains kept running and chimneys drew smoke over a sky that watched without intervening. Because the Holocaust was also the story of a silence. The silence of neighbors who did not ask. The silence of nations that did not act. The silence that turns witnesses into accomplices. In the years that followed, trials, memorials, and testimonies tried to reconstruct the irreparable. But the wound did not close. Perhaps it should not close. Because remembrance in this case is not a tribute. It is a responsibility, a commitment not to repeat, a consciousness that must remain awake, even when the world, as then, prefers to look the other way. Resistance and rebellion. Amid the chaos and brutality imposed by totalitarian regimes and foreign occupations, sparks of rebellion arose that, although often overshadowed by the great armies in motion, represented an outburst of collective dignity and individual courage. That spark of resistance ignited in dark alleys, in rusty houses, in clandestine trains, and in whispered voices. It was not a conventional army, nor an open firing line, but a network of humanity hidden in 1,000 corners of the continent, ready to defy the occupation with acts of sabotage, espionage, culture, and solidarity. And within that network, ordinary women and men found ways to face terror with intelligence, loyalty, and calculated risk. Let us begin with the first days in occupied territory, when Nazi authorities imposed rigid, uniform, and relentless control. In France, Poland, Belgium, Norway, and other territories, resistance groups began forming almost from the very first month. In some cases, like Poland, there was prior historical experience. The Armia Krajowa movement emerged from a network of officers who refused to surrender. In others, like France, intellectuals, retired military personnel, and communists joined forces to create secret organizations. Their objectives ranged from the simple distribution of leaflets, informing the population, to the open overthrow of Nazi structures. Sabotage became a silent but effective weapon. Railways were destroyed in seconds with homemade explosives. Telephone lines were cut before messages could be sent, disrupting German coordination. Fuel depots were set on fire before detection. Each small act of violence, though isolated, generated mistrust and forced the occupiers to spend additional resources on surveillance. It was an invisible war expanding in the shadows, sowing friction in machinery that until then seemed unstoppable. Espionage complemented these actions. In Norway, clandestine agents sent from London infiltrated the country disguised as workers in aluminum factories used by the Nazis and sent vital blueprints about the location of strategic installations. In Belgium, veteran officers who had escaped to England returned with shortwave radios to transmit key information about German advance plans to Allied intelligence. Thus, a communication network was woven that allowed free forces to anticipate Nazi movements. A fundamental chapter in many occupations was the aid to the persecuted. Jewish families avoided prisoners of war. People with dissenting ideas found refuge thanks to a network of citizens who risked everything. In the Netherlands, the Frank family network and their friends saved 12 people for years, enduring fear and hunger in a tiny attic. In France, networks such as Resistance and Réseau Alliance hid hundreds of Jews and sabotaged their supply on several deportation trains. Complete neutrality never existed. Choosing not to help implied complicity. Italy and the Iberian Peninsula were also scenes of rebellion. In Italy, occupied after 1943, partisan groups composed of peasants, workers, and monks ventured into the Apennines, where they sabotaged roads and attacked rear guards. From those forests came stories of destroyed convoys and daring rescues. In Spain, although there was no foreign occupation and the Franco regime supported the Axis, clandestine networks supported refugees, Allied agents, and opposition groups that transmitted valuable information about the front and helped hide exiles. These actions were geographically smaller, but morally enormous. The international brigades in Spain and the networks that aided Jews and prisoners did not operate in isolation. There was coordination among diverse groups. ETA was initially an anti-Franco movement. French Maquis coexisted with monks who sent food. In each country, resistance had its local mark. In Yugoslavia, partisans led by Tito coexisted with Chetniks, monarchists, with different agendas but equally opposed to the invasion. That diversity reflected that resistance was not a monolithic bloc, but a plural and sometimes contradictory set of wills. Culture and propaganda were also part of the rebellion. In Greece, painters and poets wrote in code to evade censorship, while clandestine radio stations broadcast music and news, sabotaging informational hegemony. In Poland, university students organized exhibitions in hidden apartments and kept alive the national language and history forbidden by the Nazis. In Italy, after the Allied advance, the clandestine station Radio Milano Libera transmitted speeches and rallies that motivated the partisans. And in that same thread, women were a fundamental driving force in the resistance. In France, female members of the Liberation Committee worked as messengers, spies, cooks, and nurses in male shelters. In the East, Soviet women integrated into the Red Army served as snipers, nurses, and fighters in formal armies. In Yugoslavia, they served as brigadistas. The female role was key in sustaining those networks under constant pressure. The outcome of many resistances came when the Allies began advancing. D-Day in France marked the beginning of the end of the occupation. Internal networks took liberated cities, arrested collaborators, and secured supply lines. In Poland, although liberated by the Red Army, many resistance groups were later persecuted by the Soviets. In Italy, with the fall of Mussolini, partisans became the spearhead of the Allies toward the north. But in every case, their contributions made liberation more effective and legitimate. Resistance and rebellion left a legacy beyond the military. They forged communities after the war, contributed to establishing collective memory, and reminded that true courage arises from everyday acts. Hiding a newspaper, stealing documents, keeping a shelter open. The stories of resistance show that, even in the darkest moments, human beings can become agents of change, not by being legendary heroes, but by being neighbors who said enough. And although for many liberation came thanks to epic tanks crossing borders, much of the real credit lies with those anonymous executors. It was a war where the enemy was inside and outside, where the act of disobedience could be as powerful as a gunshot. Those invisible networks wove freedom country by country, and from that feat was born a deep truth. Hope does not always come from armies, but from the determination of those who, despite fear, keep moving forward. Resistance was rebellion, human fire in a war of machines. It was the moral gear that moved the war machinery toward freedom. Stalingrad, where the Nazi advance dies. When the first mists of autumn in 1942 covered the banks of the Volga River, the military heart of Germany believed it was touching the sky. Stalingrad, the city that bore the name of the Soviet dictator, had been chosen by Adolf Hitler as a strategic and symbolic objective. It was not merely a point on the map. It was a key location for controlling river routes, securing the oil fields of the Caucasus, and above all, delivering a decisive blow to the pride of Joseph Stalin. The offensive launched against that city was planned as an unstoppable machine. The German soldier was to advance without rest, crushing lines of defense that had yet to imagine the urban hell that awaited them. From the first gunshots, Stalingrad became a labyrinth of ruins. There was no space for classic military maneuvering. The streets turned into trenches, the factories into fortresses, and the apartments into vertical battlefields. What had begun as a lightning offensive was transformed into house-to-house combat, from basement to basement, into desperate epic struggle. Every surviving building was a weapons depot, every corner a trap. Measuring success in meters gained or lost, the Wehrmacht found itself trapped in a scenario it had designed for its enemies. And the Volga, with its endless current, became a symbolic border between life and death. The ferocity of the fighting was such that the river filled with corpses, containers, sunken tanks, and bodies dragged by the current. The nights became duels of torches. Civilians trapped in partially destroyed buildings, Soviet and German soldiers exchanging fire at close range, sometimes less than 10 steps apart. The morale of both sides was tested in extreme conditions. The cold slowly degraded the men, supplies were almost non-existent, and hunger became a constant companion. And yet, amid that nightmare, the human spirit reaffirmed itself with each burst of shrapnel. They fought for crumbling walls, for names written in graffiti, for hidden relatives. They fought to defend a homeland, or for the hope of an imperial idea. The head of the Soviet defense, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, understood that Germany had walked into a deadly trap. Despite the chaos that initially disorganized the city, resistance reorganized within makeshift military training pits, adapted to the urban desolation. Soviet units, often composed of civilians armed with light weapons and homemade grenades, merged with regular soldiers, forming combat groups divided by invisible rivers that crossed every warehouse and pile of rubble. The enemy was inside. The hatred and hope of the Soviet soldier fed each other, displaying a strength that surprised the invader. On the other side of the Volga, German strategy began to show cracks. General Friedrich Paulus, in command of the 6th Division, had believed in victory to the point of rejecting any suggestion of withdrawal or reorganization. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with holding on to symbolic names, forbade any retreat. Rather than lose Stalingrad, the Red Army launched an encircling operation known as Uranus. Soviet allies from the north and south converged and closed the circle around more than 1 million Axis soldiers. The city, already bled dry from direct combat, now prepared for another kind of battle, one of hunger, surrender, and hope versus despair. Inside the encirclement, the Germans tried to resist with air-dropped supplies, but the cold and Soviet bombings made it useless. Day by day, winter turned Stalingrad into a frozen bowl of scarcity. Rations were microscopic. Soldiers wearing summer uniforms became victims of frostbite. Everyone knew their fate. Surrender was humiliating. Killing each other, absurd. The German army, trained for offensive movement, now faced an enemy that had decided to leave nothing behind. The wounded were shot to avoid dying in agony. Prisoners were handed over to shadow and snow. On the 31st of January 1943, the last German stronghold, under the command of Paulus, surrendered. Germany had lost its entire 6th Division. It was the first time in modern German history that a marshal had surrendered. Stalingrad had been reduced to ruins, its population practically exterminated or expelled. But the Soviet victory did more than liberate a city. It marked the end of Germany's advance in the east. The Germans had walked into what they believed was their bowl, and instead were dragged into their own trap. The Battle of Stalingrad marked the beginning of the irreversible decline of the Third Reich. It was both a symbolic and strategic defeat. The Soviet forces, once reorganized, went on the offensive. Adolf Hitler, for the first time, saw his army beaten by a force he could not humiliate. It was a moment when Europe, devastated by war, saw a hint that the tide could turn. The testimonies that emerged from that frozen trench, from letters burned in campfires to prisoners recounting their final moments amid bombs, paint a portrait of strength and horror. Stalingrad marked the turning point, a place that transformed military geography worldwide, but also affirmed something deeper. When oppression is brutal, the response can be even stronger. The urban hell by the Volga reminds us that even in ruins, the will of a people can become the mother of change. And there, in those eternal ashes, a hope began to grow, one that is difficult to extinguish. The Normandy Invasion. The dawn of that 6th of June 1944 shattered the silence of the English Channel with a thunder that still echoes in collective memory. It marked the beginning of the largest amphibious operation in military history, a leap into the void filled with daring and hope, planned for months in dark rooms over maps saturated with markings, red lines, and code names. The invasion of Normandy was more than a landing. It was a clever challenge to Europe's destiny, a declaration of resistance confirming that the tide had begun its final shift. From the earliest morning hours, thousands of Allied paratroopers and glider troops crossed the French sky. British near Caen, Canadians at Juneau, Americans at Utah and Omaha. Each dropped into the night to breach German defenses, destroy observation posts, and secure bridges before the naval arrival. Landing craft and destroyers advanced in infamous waves toward beaches forever etched in war memory. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The roar of naval and aerial artillery merged with splintering wood and the ragged shouts of men. The sand became hostile terrain, full of underwater obstacles, barbed wire, mines, and crossfire. There, courage faced its true baptism. At Omaha, German resistance had reinforced bunkers with improvised fortifications. As the first craft approached and men stepped into the icy water, bullets rained down, and advancing meant wading through rivers of blood and fire. On the wet sand, survivors raced for cover behind sandbags and rocks while officers attempted to reorganize units amid chaos. It was absolute horror turned into collective heroism. Every inch gained carried the weight of a promise. That beach was the gateway to Europe's liberation. Meanwhile, at Utah and the northern corners of Normandy, resistance was less lethal. Allied engineers threw fire barrages, prior bombardments, and deception operations, like Operation Fortitude, which convinced the Germans to anticipate an attack at Pas-de-Calais, allowed many troops to land more safely. Yet no one escaped sacrifice. Field medics treated the wounded as soldiers advanced along rural roads, liberated occupied villages, and established beachheads. Each village liberated became a link in the reconquest chain. The operation was coordinated with almost surgical precision. Paratroopers secured crossings and key routes. Air forces delayed enemy reinforcements. Engineers built makeshift bridges over rivers. Naval units to the west provided constant fire support to keep the Wehrmacht in check. It was a perfectly synchronized machine of shared courage, comprised of Britons, Americans, Canadians, Poles, Belgians, New Zealanders, and even German deserters. Above all, an army rebuilt on ideals of unity and liberty. Throughout D-Day and the following days, the beaches filled with improvised fortifications, field hospitals, ambulances, tanks, and supply-laden trucks. The first days were crucial, capturing Carentan, Saint-Lô, Caen, and linking the landing sectors. That rainy June became a race against time while the Wehrmacht responded with armored reserves. Fierce clashes erupted in woods and country lanes, erupting around crossroads, intersections, and farmhouses. British commando brigades cleared bunkers by the dozens, wiping out enemy garrisons from the ruins. American Rangers scaled cliffs at Pointe du Hoc to neutralize artillery batteries that threatened the landings. Each individual feat contributed to a collective effort where no unit could survive alone. It was a technical and emotional undertaking where the invaders' morale depended as much on daring action as on the certainty that nothing remained behind. By the 12th of June, the Allies had secured a continuous coastal strip of more than 40 kilometers. Tens of thousands of soldiers advanced inland. The beachhead began to widen and deepen, fueled by daily reinforcements and a whirlwind logistical system. The Mulberry Artificial Harbor and the massive submerged pipelines known as Pluto supplied fuel, vehicles, and food. D-Day had been only the beginning of a logistic chain sustaining the advance toward the heart of France. The Normandy landing resulted from unprecedented military engineering, from deception operations involving inflatable tanks and dummy equipment to mass troop training under realistic conditions. It was all designed so the Germans would never know where, when, or how the attack would come. And when bombs fell, fires raged, and bodies littered the sand, the human machinery functioned with brutal efficiency. Behind the tactical success lay a profound human heartbeat. Stories emerged. A soldier sharing his ration with a French child, Normandy families sheltering British airmen, French doctors treating combatants without regard for nationality. Liberation was a military achievement, yes, but also a moral project, a feat meant to leave a legacy not only geopolitical but spiritual. Above all, the Normandy invasion was a strategic earthquake. It shattered the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht, forced Adolf Hitler to shift forces westward, accelerated the opening of the Italian front, and triggered the synchronized collapse of Nazi power. It was the spark igniting the liberation of Paris in August, freeing the camps, and restoring dignity to occupied peoples. Normandy was more than a landing. It was the gateway through which Europe began walking toward itself again. The beaches where thousands of soldiers fell became shrines. White crosses rose in the sand to honor those who drove the continent's fate forward with their lives. D-Day became a living myth. Yet, its lesson remains concrete. Changing history requires collective decision, bravery, preparation, and hope. And the clearest evidence, in the face of determination, the improbable is just an unprecedented opportunity. The front collapses, Germany cornered. When the dawn of 1945 timidly appeared over a devastated continent, Europe was ablaze everywhere, and Germany was no longer the invincible force it had once been. Allied offensives converged from the east and west, bearing down with relentless force. From Normandy to the Volga, Hitler's military empire began to crumble. The front, once sprawling with arrogance and dominance, now folded back in successive layers, each weaker than the last. Thus, Germany went from invading to disintegrating, from imposing its will to desperately seeking a refuge that did not exist. The collapse of the Reich from the Western Allies began after the Normandy breakout. From August 1944, American, British, Canadian, and other Allied armies advanced through French territory, liberated Paris, and pushed into Belgium, the Netherlands, and finally Germany. The offensive resembled a human tsunami, tanks smashing through lines, infantry moving through ruined towns, and ad hoc humanitarian corridors. German defenses, improvised bunkers cut off from power, with civilians exhausted inside, collapsed under each day's renewed Allied advance. Each day brought new breaches from the West, and the Nazi war machine became increasingly dependent on fragile logistics, with blown bridges, impassable rivers, and critically low fuel. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army liberated Eastern Europe with devastating force. After Stalingrad, the Soviets had pressed forward. In mid-1944, they launched Operation Bagration, one of the most destructive military campaigns in modern history. Within weeks, they destroyed much of the German Army Group Center, liberated Belarus, and reached the Polish border. It was a strategic blow beyond mere tactics, the collapse of the Berlin-Moscow axis. Their advance carried urgency and historical vengeance, fueled by memories of bombings, repression, and the Holocaust. Every kilometer gained carried profound meaning. Confronted from both directions, German tactics fragmented. Hitler, absent mentally and diplomatically, retreated to his bunker. Decrees like Iron Belt and Fight to the Last sentenced soldiers to death. Exhausted troops with no training were shuffled from front to front. The Luftwaffe had become irrelevant, the panzer divisions obsolete, and the Volkssturm, a militia of old men and teenagers, fought with inadequate weaponry. This doctrinal desperation proved fatal. By autumn 1944, the Netherlands offensive, Operation Market Garden, failed, stalling the massive airborne attempt to cross the Rhine and encircle Western Germany. Nazi defenses held firm, and the Allies were forced to withdraw, losing critical momentum. Yet the overall trend remained unchanged. Each day the Rhine remained uncrossed. The Soviets advanced further east, taking Warsaw, Vienna, and Krakow. Germany's noose tightened. From the skies, Allied air forces intensified bombing campaigns. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden. Centuries-old cities were reduced to ruins. Subterranean shelters offered scant protection. Smoke rose in columns, and winter forced cold lines of prisoners and refugees to march toward non-existent borders. The psychological strain was immense. Combat was no longer defined by military lines, but by daily survival amid devastation. While the West advanced with tactical setbacks but strategic determination, Stalin made a decisive move that sealed Germany's fate. In 1944, Soviet forces liberated the Balkans, Hungary, and much of Czechoslovakia. By December, they reached the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. It was a prelude to the final assault. With 40 divisions at the city's doorstep, the Red Army matched German strength there. The Reich was entrapped between two giants. In March 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine unopposed. It was a false gift. German defenses crumbled before exhausted, equipmentless, penniless, and faithless forces. The advance slowed only to synchronize fronts and conserve resources. But as the armored divisions crossed, the Wehrmacht retreated creek by creek, demolishing or blocking every passage, an effort that became a last futile shelter before ultimate collapse. That winter and spring, the German people lived in a nightmare. Cities became inhabited ruins, trains stopped running, bread was rationed, local authorities either surrendered or vanished. Nazi rule ended, kept alive only by terror and the loyalty of fanatical cadres. In towns and villages, ordinary people organized spontaneous relief efforts. Students, women, and children worked to leave bombs unexploded, feed minimal rations, and fill mass graves. Hunger was a collective condition. On the 16th of April, the battle for Berlin began. Soviet units entered from the east, British and American troops from the west, but the Central Front, controlled by Hitler, was dominated by Russian and Polish forces. The battle for the capital saw streets of concrete turned into death traps. Buildings became death alley battlegrounds. Basements were underground fortresses. Tanks shelled the Reichstag while soldiers in tatters, out of ammunition, fired from shattered windows. It was the final twilight. On the 30th of April, after days of fighting, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. With him fell the myth of invincibility. Karl Dönitz assumed control and ordered partial surrenders. But Berlin did not fall without demanding several more days of fanatical resistance. Soviet troops seized the historic center, raised the red flag over domes, and then over blackened ruins. On the 7th of May, Germany signed unconditional surrender in Reims. The 8th of May was celebrated as Victory in Europe Day. On that day, the Third Reich ceased to exist as a military structure. It was left politically and morally devastated, with millions displaced, prisoners, civilians dead and wounded. In its downfall, it provided a concrete demonstration that even the most organized and destructive regime can be defeated when all fronts unite against it. Germany's cornering was a collective symphony. Soldiers in trenches, spies passing intelligence, workers burning pipelines, women healing wounds, diplomats negotiating local surrenders. It proved that war, when directed against a force from every direction, can dismantle even its core. It was a historical lesson underscoring a human truth. No colossus survives when everything around it becomes its adversary. Germany's fall, burdened by guilt and ruins, also marked the dawn of a new European path, steeped in the lesson of what happens when totalitarian darkness is built upon scorched earth. Berlin, the final days of the Reich. As spring advanced in 1945, Berlin, once the symbol of power and grandeur of the Third Reich, had become a hell of ruins, death, and desperation. Its streets, once majestic avenues built for parades and demonstrations of force, had turned into trenches fed by the final gasps of an ideology that clung on even in destruction. And in this landscape filled with corpses, smoke, and burning buildings, unfolded the last days of Adolf Hitler, and of a regime that had spread across Europe with bombs and hatred, and now agonized among rubble, paranoia, and betrayal from within. The Red Army's advance on the German capital had been voracious since late April. Stalin's orders were clear: take Berlin before Victory in Europe Day to ensure political dominance over the heart of the Reich. Soviet troops advanced from multiple fronts, east and south, crossing polluted rivers, destroyed bridges, and makeshift defenses. Each apartment block was taken in hand-to-hand combat, building by building, with an intensity reminiscent of Stalingrad. Though this time the enemy was cornered, exhausted, and the world's gaze had shifted. The West watched as the horror within the bunker, visible only to a few, approached its final moment. Hitler had set up his command post in the bunker beneath the Chancellery, at the heart of the city. There, surrounded by his closest confidants, officers, doctors, and secretaries, he clung to criminal logic. He still believed the situation could be reversed with a devastating counterattack, even though chaos reigned around him. The upper floors were being consumed by bombs, and Soviet tanks were capable of shelling the bunker from mere hundreds of meters away. His speeches became erratic, laced with pauses, paranoid visions, and suicidal decrees. He ordered mass suicides of those around him, killed his dogs, and gave instructions to ensure no written legacy remained for the victors to uncover. In those final moments, the atmosphere in the bunker fluctuated between tragic solemnity and the grotesque sadness of a suicidal cult. Eva Braun, his companion, married him in a dim ceremony, within a few fleeting hours of normality amidst the horror, wearing a simple dress as artillery echoed above. It was an intimate, desperate gesture, but also the image of a power enthralled with its own collapse. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide along with Eva Braun. Listening to Wagner and surrounded by a handful of his most loyal collaborators, he shot himself. His remains were burned in the Chancellery courtyard, as per his wishes, so that no body could be displayed. And with his death, the symbol of the Reich vanished. Karl Dönitz was left as nominal successor, leading a government that crumbled within days, issuing partial surrenders, and attempting to preserve some minimum legal continuity. Meanwhile, outside the bunker, the city had fallen into Soviet hands. Fire turned buildings into columns of black smoke. Trains looked like twisted skeletons, and civilians, trapped between bombings, collapsed shelters, and complete supply collapse, suffered a relentless agony. Hunger, disease, looting. Berlin was a living corpse, but that corpse still fired bullets. The obliteration of its urban density, its plazas, ponds, and consecrated churches, became the backdrop of crossfire. Every building had a story, and every story was interrupted by direct impact. The Reichstag, symbolic, was the final bastion. It was captured by the Soviets on May 2nd, beneath the red flag and a historic surprise. Soviet spokespersons demanded the surrender of the guard beneath the building. It was a global political message. The Reich had been trapped in its own capital. On May 4th, British and Danish forces captured Kiel and dismantled remaining units in the north. On the 6th, American soldiers secured areas west of the Elbe River, linking up with Soviet troops who had surrounded Berlin from the east. The Reich no longer existed as a coherent territorial entity. Only remnants remained, scattered pockets of resistance that either surrendered locally or dissolved entirely. On May 7th, Karl Jodl signed the unconditional surrender in Reims. May 8th, 1945 was celebrated as Victory in Europe Day, while in Berlin, among improvised chapels and red flags waving atop scorched buildings, survivors began to emerge, terrified, into a world they had been unable to save. And with that gesture, the Reich officially ended, leaving behind a human and material toll that would take decades to rebuild. Millions displaced, crimes untried, evidence of horror, repatriated corpses, and a city divided into occupation zones by each Allied force. The final days of the Reich offer a terrifying reflection. That absolute power, when sustained solely through systemic terror and individual obsession, self-destructs from within. Berlin was both the symbolic and literal grave of that deadly machine. The ruins of the Chancellery were sealed off by the Soviets. The Brandenburg Gate stood scarred among charred bricks. The remnants of the Nazi government scattered into the dark geography of the world, attempting to hide, while the Nuremberg trials already planned their judicial legacy. And among the ashes, buildings slowly rose again, not to restore legitimacy, but to remind us that history can rebuild monuments without recovering their meaning. Because the silence in that bunker was broken by a gunshot, and its reverberation, lost among stones and psyches, remains a warning. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the end of the world. At dawn on August 6, 1945, over the peaceful city of Hiroshima, the sky burst open in an explosion of light and power that, in a single instant, eclipsed everything humanity had known until that moment. What followed was the end of an era and the beginning of a nightmare that still lingers in our collective memory. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan marked a before and after, not just for the war, but for our understanding of power, destruction, and the value of human life. Hiroshima was a military city, yes, but also a home, a place of alleyways, markets, schools, children playing, and concrete buildings. At 8:15 a.m., the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped a bomb named Little Boy. After release, the plane flew several kilometers away, and then the explosion unfolded with a violence beyond any previous description. Temperatures of several million degrees in a fraction of a second, a shockwave that leveled buildings, bridges, and people, and an invisible radiation that began to spread with deadly silence. The epicenter became a burning crater, a place that vaporized bodies and dreams alike. The scene was Dantean. People who just moments earlier were going about their routines found themselves engulfed in a hell of fire, smoke, and a rising artificial sun. Those who didn't die instantly suffered grotesque burns, blinded eyes, torn skin, collapsed lungs, and internal organs exposed to a radiation that would continue killing in the days that followed. Doctors, healers, and caretakers faced a catastrophe with no treatment, no experience, no capacity to respond. Hiroshima became, overnight, not just a Japanese city, but a symbol of nuclear threat, of unleashed human fury, and of our fragility in the face of absolute destruction. In the first few months, the death toll quickly reached 100,000, and later doubled. The medical consequences, cancer, leukemia, infertility, birth defects, emerged in the bodies of survivors, the hibakusha, who carried physical and emotional scars for decades. Their testimonies describe flashes of light that erased color from the world, voices crying from the ruins, eerie calm before the chaos, children with melted skin, corpses fused into the earth and flame. The human body turned into a symphony of horror. Japan, still grappling with the fascination that the event inspired in American power, did not immediately surrender. Military leaders and the emperor deliberated amid devastating images and fragmented reports. They believed they could continue the war, hold out longer, negotiate better terms. But the Allies, who had already unleashed their full might in the Pacific after Okinawa and the Philippines, were ready to intensify the offensive. With that resolve came the second, and even more controversial strike. On August 9th, a second B-29 Boxcar dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki, a port city with a less dense population than Hiroshima, but whose hilly topography focused the devastation with brutal precision. Over 70,000 people died instantly. Many others were exposed to radiation levels bordering on the unnatural. What followed was a slow collapse. As the bombs shattered all sense of security, the world realized, in an instant moral abyss, that nuclear power was a force capable of erasing civilization in seconds. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people publicly for the first time. In solemn ancient Japanese, he announced unconditional surrender. He said a new, unknown, and more terrible bomb had cast its shadow over humanity, and that continuing to fight would mean the total annihilation of the nation. The war was over, and with it, the century that had believed it could dominate through terror. But the drama didn't end with the conflict. Rebuilding Hiroshima and Nagasaki became a race against time, memory, and the desire to forget. Ruins were rebuilt, sometimes alongside peace monuments. Cities became museums, serving as warnings. Therapies emerged to heal both body and mind. The hibakusha became living proof of an evil permitted by military logic, political calculus, imperial ambition. Their bodies reflected social pressure, stigma, the silence of shame, and the conviction that this turning point marked a moral frontier. It was the end of the war, yes, but also the beginning of the nuclear world. Because Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just bombs, they were warnings, reproaches, open wounds in the global conscience. They signified that the threat was real, that humanity was capable of creating something so devastating no one would dare use it again. Those cities became sanctuaries of eternal vigilance. The end of the world, a phrase often found in documents, novels, films, began there. It was no longer fantasy. It became a living condition for millions. With the atomic bomb, the world no longer had traditional borders. Anyone could be a target. Anyone could be a victim. And unknowingly, humanity wrote the first chapter of the Cold War. In the following decade, while the US and the Soviet Union raced to build even more powerful arsenals, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of victory, of guilt, of warning, of moral reckoning. Survivors and activists worked tirelessly to turn their tragedy into a global message. Ban nuclear weapons, recognize the horror, assume collective responsibility. Their words, no more Hiroshimas, never again the bomb, moved from testimony to political demand. Politically, the bombings and Japan's surrender marked the formal end of World War II, but also opened a new age of global tensions. The nuclear arms race, ideological rivalry, hardened military alliances, and the fear of a future war that would not be conventional. The devastated cities remained fixed in the next century's imagination. Their memory compelled treaties, inspections, limits, and debates about disarmament, ethics, science, and responsibility. And though half a century later, treaties and organizations, like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, were created, the traces of radiation and social memory remain silent witnesses. In Hiroshima, an annual memorial ceremony is held. Paper cranes are released. Messages are read aloud. The commitment to peace is renewed. It's a ritual that repeats. What happened stands as a warning, a contemporary myth, a never-ending struggle between technology and life. Because the light that lit up the sky that day was the beginning of the war's end, but also the end of a collective innocence that, in seconds, understood the price of total annihilation. And that price remains etched in the heart of the world. After the storm, a new world order. When the smoke cleared, the cities lay in ruins, and the survivors looked up at an empty sky. The world appeared as if wiped clean after a storm. Europe was split. To the west, ruins, displaced people, and promises of reconstruction. To the east, occupation, repression, and a new bloc rising under the Kremlin's shadow. Asia was absorbing the impact of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the divided Korean peninsula was already becoming a flashpoint in the new geopolitics. The emerging world order was not a reset or return to the past. It was an entirely different structure, founded on military alliances, fierce rivalries, international organizations, and the awareness that global horror had forever rewritten the rules of human coexistence. To begin with, it was impossible to ignore that the military balance had radically shifted. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. They had deployed forces capable of altering any regional front in a matter of hours. Liberal capitalism and authoritarian communism faced off in a quiet but intense confrontation. The Cold War. There were no massive armies crossing borders, but there was espionage, arms races, propaganda, and proxy conflicts, from Greece to Vietnam. Europe, consumed by pain, became a divided board. To the east, the USSR raised its Iron Curtain. To the west, the United States promoted integration with plans like the Marshall Plan, not just to rebuild physically, but to contain ideologies. The United Nations was born with the goal of preventing new world wars. The idea was noble, but its execution proved problematic. The Security Council became a theater of constant vetoes. The United States, the Soviet Union, France, the United Kingdom, and China could block any action. The voices of newly created or liberated nations, emerging states across Africa and Asia, were barely heard. Even so, the UN represented the beginning of a universal aspiration, an imperfect but necessary structure that tied acts of war to human rights principles and supposed impartiality, at least on paper. Europe began its reconstruction with unprecedented economic and political ambition. The Schuman Plan and the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, eventually evolving into the European Union, was a bet on interdependence as a mechanism for peace. The idea was to replace old antagonisms, fueled by industrial and territorial rivalries, with collective benefit, integration, representative democracy, freedom, social security. These became the new guiding principles, all in stark contrast to an East that maintained one-party regimes, political repression, and centralized economies. Occupied Germany was divided. The West experienced rapid recovery, known as the German miracle, while the East remained under Soviet control, weighed down by stagnant heavy industry and rigid political directives. Berlin, the epicenter of the division, was split by the wall in 1961, a physical and moral symbol of a divided world. Its concrete and barbed wire didn't just represent geography, they marked ideological borders that split towns, families, and memories. Japan, devastated by bombing, reinvented itself as an economic power under a new constitutional government that abolished militarism. Its 1950s and 60s were an explosion of industrialization, exports, and innovation, transforming the nation from a fallen empire into a strategic U.S. partner and a founding member of international trade and development organizations. Asia, Africa, and Latin America underwent accelerated decolonization processes as the superpowers reconfigured alliances with new nations. Borders drawn by colonial powers became new states. Some developed fragile democracies. Others turned into dictatorships backed by Moscow or Washington. Civil wars, land struggles, liberation movements broke out. Everyone spoke of freedom, but few escaped the tunnel colonialism had left behind. The Weltordnung that emerged after 1945 promised not to repeat the blood-soaked wars of the past, but introduced new conflicts with their own logic of power. Morally and culturally, the post-war period brought deep reflection. The Holocaust began to be publicly recounted, with the Nuremberg trials establishing new legal standards, crimes against humanity. Memory became a collective obligation. The Hibakusha demanded a new scientific ethic, control over atomic advances, documentation of horror, and policies for disarmament. Literature, film, and testimonies insisted on the danger of repeating genocide or total war. That narrative fed treaties and conventions, but it also weighed on the conscience. War had shown that total destruction was now technologically possible. The relationship between science and power, exposed by the atomic bomb, forced a reassessment of the social contract. Progress was no longer solely for improvement. It could now annihilate. A new moral artifact was born: control the technology, or die under its impact. Physics became an ethical battlefield. Educational, scientific, and rhetorical policies were promoted to ensure that what had once been violated would never be repeated. 40 years later, with the formal end of the Soviet Union, the stable order that had emerged after 1945 began transforming once again. The wall fell. Much of Europe was unified. NATO, originally created to contain communist expansion, extended eastward. Japan continued growing as an economic and cultural balancing force. China emerged from its revolution and formed another bloc. The memory of the war remained: museums, monuments, memorials, veterans. The bombs were distant, but the microscopic world of violence remained close. After the storm, an unfinished global pact emerged. A web of alliances, institutions, and narratives that continues, despite tensions, crises, and conflicts, to hold back the possibility of absolute destruction. It was a collective survival act. If the 20th century had produced total war and industrial genocide, the post-1945 order aimed for something different, to ensure it would never happen again. Through diplomacy, military strategy, technical agreements, and cultural shifts. That idea still walks on fragile ground. With every war, every dictatorship, every manipulation, the shadow returns. But one principle remains clear. The world understood that total destruction had already occurred, and that lesson, written in shadows and fractured words, binds nations in a collective promise. After the storm, whatever may come, there is a new contract with humanity. And so ends this journey through World War II, a story that still echoes in every corner of the planet and reminds us, with brutal clarity, of what we are capable of destroying and rebuilding. If this narration made you think, learn, or feel something different, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you'd like to keep exploring history's mysteries with me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Many more nights of stories like this await us. Good night.